The Honourable Ruth Dyson.
Mr Speaker, can I first of all commend the member who's just resumed his seat for that excellent contribution to a very good bill. A lot of people say of the member, Simon O'Connor, well, he's no Rob Muldoon, and I'm sure that he would see that in two lights.
Yeah.
You know, he might see some good sides to that comment and some bad sides. But I've heard people say more recently, no, that's right, and he's no Clem Simic either. Clem came here to Parliament to give Wellington a message. He said, I know that when he left, a lot of us were still asking him what the message was. I don't think they'll be saying that about Simon O'Connor. I think he's very clear about what he wants to contribute in this House. He's the chair of the Health Select Committee now, I understand. Is that correct? Yes, he is. And I'm sure that he'll do a very fine job of shepherding this bill through the House. I'm not surprised that he got tongue-tied on occasions. I'm not even going to attempt to say the terms that he used. I'm not on the Health Select Committee, so I don't have to fall into that trap, but I actually think that he demonstrated a grasp on the key issues that are not only contained in this bill, but the ones that have been omitted from the bill, either because they weren't considered a priority or relevant, or the government made a conscious decision to omit them. So, Mr Speaker, I hope it's clear from the comments that our health spokesperson, the Honourable Annette King, has made in my introductory comments that Labor supports this bill to Select Committee. In fact, it was a government led by Labor in the early 2000s that started off this process of getting to the radiation safety bill in 2002, instigated by the Honourable Annette King, who is very knowledgeable in this area and has made some quite provocative comments to the House tonight, which I hope are carried forward onto the Select Committee for the discussion and submissions. In fact, I'll be joining in the audience at the Select Committee to hear the debate around some of the issues that I'll mention later in the speech, but some of them that are omitted out of this bill. So the Honourable Annette King said in 2002 we need to start a review of this process, and that was led by the Ministry of Health. One of the critical reasons for that is that this legislation that we're now proposing to amend with this bill is actually dated 1965. Well, that's older than you or I, Mr Speaker. Well, pretty close to being older than you or I, Mr Speaker. It's about in our age range. But it's certainly in need of some substantial revamp given the technological changes that have happened in that time. It's also really important to recognise that people's attitude towards exposure to substances that damage, deliberately or otherwise, has changed quite markedly over that intervening time. People are much less reluctant now to be exposed to chemicals, to treatments, to therapies, to medicines, which in the past they would have just taken and said, this might do me some harm, but overall it's for the good. So we're becoming a little more rigorous in our consideration. That extends also to where food is from, how food has been grown, how food has been treated, and that's another subject that I want to get on later in my contribution. So one of the purposes of this bill, the Radiation Safety Bill, is to enable New Zealand to meet its international obligations relating to radiation protection. Obviously that's something that has to be a no-brainer across the House. There wouldn't be a member of this House that doesn't want us to comply to international obligations, but also to radiation safety and security, nuclear non-proliferation under a range of international treaties. I did enjoy hearing the member talk so passionately about and give his absolute commitment that this legislation, this bill, would not undermine New Zealand's nuclear-free stance. How well the National Party have progressed over recent years. It was just a few short years ago that member's leader was assuring the country that under a national-led government, the nuclear-free legislation would be gone by lunchtime. Those were his very words. And now we have from the member, and he's not a new member either, he's been here a little while, he's proven himself to be, he's hungry, clearly, didn't make it through dinner time, but he's not a new member, and giving the House that assurance is really a bit of an indication of how much the National Party has progressed, but only in this area. only in this area. Sometimes you do get mixed messages from the National Party. I've heard members of the National Party say they're business friendly, for example. I've heard them say that, you know, in public meetings. And here they are, charging businesses and employees in New Zealand $350 million more than they need to, and costing 700 jobs. It's got to do with people saying one thing and meaning another. There is a term for that which cannot be used in this House, so I'm not going to, but I was giving that as an example of a second occurrence exactly in line with the contribution that the Honourable Member Simon O'Connor made in talking about this bill not undermining our nuclear-free status. The link is very obvious. Even for you, Mr Foster-Bell, the link should be obvious. Mr Speaker, I just want to raise a couple of matters. One was the issue that my colleague Annette King mentioned, and that is the increasing international awareness and concern about the effects that sunbed treatment has on people. In Australia, the use is now illegal, I think, for people of any age. It may be for people under 18, for young people and children under 18, but I'm more inclined to think that it's not a prohibited activity for people of any age. And I think that that is something that New Zealand really has to turn its mind to. We have a very high incidence in New Zealand of skin cancers of all sorts. And we know that they're often not just something that is a lump and can be removed and you're all okay as long as you keep the checks up. They can be fatal. They can take people's life much earlier than that person needed to have died. And it's got to be a 101 responsibility of central government to say if there is harm that is being done to people, that we need to educate people and perhaps protect them against by intervention. Well, that's something that the Parliament should at least give consideration to. Annette King threw the gauntlet down on that one, and I really want to add to that challenge by saying it's not something I know enough about in terms of the impact, the occurrence, the effect in New Zealand, but it's an area that I would certainly like the Select Committee to be looking at and providing us as parliamentarians with more information. Should this be an area where we should be following Australia and taking better measures to protect New Zealanders against something which is clearly doing harm and which I think most New Zealanders regard as a little bit of fun and wouldn't really think of it in doing serious damage, particularly damage which could be fatal, cause their premature death. The next point I want to comment on, which isn't covered in the legislation, is about government's consideration of importing irradiated fruit and vegetables. Now, this is something that is pretty well, Mr Speaker, pretty well slipped under the radar. I don't really know why we would be even considering importing irradiated fruit and vegetable from Queensland when we're currently hosting their fruit fly, which we don't want. Irradiation clearly didn't do any damage to them because they managed to make it over the border and cause great threat to our horticulture and agricultural sector here. So why we are considering importing fruit and vegetables that we actually have growing in New Zealand, apples, peaches, apples that they won't take in Australia, let alone allowing them to have even more. Scolopenis even. I've got a surplus of scolopenis in the garden at the moment, so if anyone's a bit short of them, come and ask me rather than bringing them in from, bringing irradiated scolopenis in from overseas, from Queensland. That's an area, Mr Speaker, that isn't covered in the bill because, as Simon O'Connor pointed out in his contribution, this doesn't go as far in terms of what areas it covered as the original 2002 consideration, the review of the 1965 legislation, and then the regulatory impact statement. So it's been narrowed a bit. I hope that further contributions in this debate can explain to us, and I think it would be a benefit to all the House as well as to the Select Committee, at what stage of the debate were those considerations to narrow the parameters of the bill made, and what were the reasons for that? They may well be very justified. This is not a party political piece of legislation actually. It's one that, as I said, was started by the Honourable Annette King. We thought it was a good idea. It's a little narrower than it may have been. There may be areas that can be added during the Select Committee process. I hope that the deliberations are rigorous. I hope that despite the perhaps slightly dull nature of the name of the bill, and I'm not referring to any contributions, I'm not going to rise to that opportunity, but I do hope that there are a lot of submissions and that this receives rigorous debate. It's a very important issue and I'm interested in its progress.